Bon dia. Bon dia a tothom. Si us sembla, anem començant, vale? Que anem uns minutets ja una mica endavant, però i així podem anar seguint els temps del matí. Val? Bueno, moltes gràcies per venir. Crec que, no, si no m'equivoco, hi ha unes 260 persones apuntades, no? Més o menys. O sigui, moltíssimes gràcies a tothom i els que ens podran seguir també via streaming. Bueno, com sabeu, és una jornada que organitzem des d'Arrels, no? I una mica sobretot el nostre objectiu d'aquestes jornades que hem anat fent durant els diferents temps és una mica xerrar, conèixer-nos, trobar-nos i sobretot aprofundir amb alguns temes. Per exemple, nosaltres vam començar l'any 2014, alguns aquí ho recordareu, vam fer unes jornades en què vam començar a parlar del Housing First, dels treballadors peer i de diferents àmbits que ho vam fer a la Universitat de Barcelona, i aquesta va ser una mica la primera de totes. Després, a continuació, l'any 2015, vam fer aquella jornada per parlar de Catalunya, de com era l'atenció. Vam acabar amb aquesta ponència que veieu aquí. No es veu això aquí, disculpeu. No passa res, ho vaig explicant igualment. D'acord. Perdoneu, presentació. D'acord. El 2014 i després el 2015, disculpeu, vam fer aquesta presentació de com estava l'atenció de persones sense llar des de Catalunya. També van venir des del Regne Unit a explicar-nos l'experiència de Homeless Link, que és una experiència molt... Perdoneu. Tinc aquí... A la tercera vindrà la bona, suposem. El 2015 vam fer això a nivell català, que van venir des del Regne Unit també a explicar-nos la seva experiència del treball en xarxa. L'any 2016 vam fer una altra jornada on aprofundíem més l'aplicació pràctica del Housing First, que van venir el Tim Harley de Canadà i el Sam Semberis dels Estats Units, i també ens ho van explicar. Aquesta, si no recordo malament, ja la trobeu a internet també si voleu, és la primera que vam fer més streaming i que també la podeu recuperar en algun moment, perquè és molt interessant sentir tant el Tim Harley com el Sam Semberis. I el 2017 vam fer una altra amb la Begoña Román, que també va venir el llavors síndic de Greuges, el Rafael Ribó, per parlar-nos dels drets i de l'ètica amb l'atenció a les persones sense llar, que també podeu trobar i podeu recuperar en streaming per internet. Després volíem fer el 2018, però al final vam intentar fer el 2019, però com sabeu, el 2019 hi va haver una pandèmia i tot això es van allargar els tempos. Llavors ara, una mica aquest any, precisament, el que volem és enfocar-nos en això, en aquesta jornada, per parlar sobretot del trauma, el trauma que han viscut les persones que dormen al carrer, les seves vides, i com poden enfocar aquesta aproximació, aquest treball amb les persones que dormen al carrer, tenint en compte aquesta situació psicològica i emocional de les persones tan dura. Per una banda, ara ens parlarà amb Peter Cockersell, que és doctor psicoterapeuta, psicoanalista i director executiu de l'entitat Community Housing and Therapy, i que té experiència en acompanyament de persones sense llar. Després també ens parlarà el doctor Adam... Després tindrem, la taula rodona amb la Paula Martínez, el Mario Salvador, que ens moderarà el doctor Roca, i es introduiran ells una mica la seva expertesa. I finalment també tindrem el doctor Adam Birle, que ens parlarà de l'entorn psicològicament informat. Llavors, només dir-vos això, agrair-vos estar aquí, esperem que sigui molt profitosa aquesta jornada i que ens vagi molt bé a tots per poder demà començar a atendre millor les persones. I ara donem pas al doctor Peter Cockersell, que ens parlarà de com aplicar la psicologia, la psicoteràpia i l'entorn psicològicament informat a les persones sense llar. Gràcies. No cal.
is this one, Barcelona? Is this one, yes?
Or I can use the buttons here, presumably. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Does that Buenos días. Buenos días. Yeah, that is. Gracias a haberme invitado aquí a Barcelona. Barcelona. Estoy muy agradecido. Yo hablo un poco de español, pero no voy a presentar porque no creo que hablo suficiente para hacer todo eso en español. Y además no hablo catalán, entonces voy a hablar en inglés. So I'm going to present on social exclusion, the processes of social exclusion, and talk about compound trauma, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care and psychologically informed environments. So first of all, social exclusion. I don't know if you can see the little sign in the corner there, the cardboard sign. You certainly can't at the back, I shouldn't think. It says, "Once I was like you." And I think everybody who is rough sleeping, once they were like us at some stage, even if only when they were born. But there's a process of social exclusion. It isn't something that is inevitable. So that's what I'm going to talk about first of all, the process of social exclusion. And look at it first of all from the background, the social determinants of health. And these figures here show the life expectancy in Britain on the left-hand side for the poorest people in Britain, on the right-hand side for the richest people in Britain. And the social determinants of health are equality or inequality, housing, sanitation, education, social stability, including family stability, and access to health care. Big social issues that affect all of us. And they're very different for different people. Some housing is very squalid. There's 1 million people using food banks in Britain now. There's a lot of people can't afford, working people, as well as non-working people, can't afford enough to buy food. There's housing. I think these rough sleepers with the advert for your Prada sunglasses says something. And this is inequality of wealth. And you see the top 8% of people have 85% of the wealth in the world. This is, I think, from 2015. It's got worse since then. What does it matter, inequality? So we know there's inequality. Why does it matter? Well, one simple thing is if you look at inequality in diagnosed mental health, you see a direct correlation by the degree of inequality in a society and the amount of diagnosed mental health. Inequality is bad for people. It's damaging to us all as individuals. It's damaging to society. That is one of the big social causes of mental illness. So, the social and the individual. This is from Zygmunt Bauman, who's a professor of sociology. Although the risks and contradictions of life go on being as socially produced as ever, the duty of and necessity of coping with them is delegated to our individual selves. So although society is unjust and unequal, we have to deal with that individually, and very often the blame for it gets laid at the individual who is the victim of the inequality and the injustice. It starts off with an individual. We all start off being born. If we're lucky, we have a mother who looks after us. It starts off with attachment, the very basic, probably the strongest of all human biological drives is attachment. The first thing baby does is reach out and cry and call for its mother. And there is a response, the care-giving response, and the mother reaches out and holds the baby and strokes it. That human contact, the attachment, is the fundamental thing that drives us. The tests of attachment done with other primates and with human beings is that social contact is more important than anything. We're used to Maslow's hierarchy, where food and shelter are the most basic things, but social contact is actually underneath that. If people don't have a reason to live and they don't have any relationships, they don't care about food and shelter, as we've met many people who've will let themselves die because of their social estrangement. So attachment is fundamental. And you probably all know this, there are two main types of attachment: secure attachment and insecure attachment. And insecure attachment has been divided up by psychologists, starting with Mary Ainsworth, who really developed attachment theory, into anxious, ambivalent, avoidant, and disorganized, various degrees of attachment. In the sort of normal distribution, around 60-65%, maybe even 70% of people have a secure attachment pattern. They feel quite comfortable in who they are. Around 30-35% have an insecure attachment pattern in ordinary society. And attachment comes from having good relations with your primary carers, and good attachments, secure attachments, being brought up in a happy family with a loving parents. Insecure attachment arises from disturbed, broken, distressing family situations where there's a lot of anger or drunkenness or violence or separation or illness or death, or and there's fear and horror and sadness. So attachment patterns are dynamic. They are driven by the behavior of the primary carer, and according to what the behavior is, will affect the child's attachment pattern. So they will become secure or they will be anxious or ambivalent or avoidant or disorganized according to the behaviors of the people who are looking after them, whether that's their parents or institutions or foster carers or whoever, or a series of people. And of course, the people who are looking after them may be more than one group of people. We have a hierarchy of attachment to the different people. So we might have our parents or our primary carers, grandparents, neighbors, teachers, so on. And different ones will have different behaviors towards us, and we'll have a hierarchy of attachment. So we may have some ambivalent, some avoidant, and so on. When you think of that attachment is affected by your early experience, then this was taken from a sample of rough sleepers in London. 47% had experienced early neglect or emotional abuse. 34% had lost their parents through abandonment, separation, or divorce. 31% had lost their parents through death at an early age, including murder and suicide. 27% reported sexual abuse, which I think was highly underreported, but that was the number who said it. And they talked about high levels of parental alcoholism, drug use, and domestic violence. That was their experience. And a study of attachment patterns in rough sleepers in Lisbon, done by a psychologist called Elias Barreto, which hasn't been published yet, but which I hope is going to be published in the next few months, found no secure attachment patterns, 0%, not 60%, but 0%, 100% insecure, and 20% anxious, ambivalent, 27% avoidant, but 50% disorganized. And disorganized in mental health services is correlated with high levels of disturbance, high levels of psychopathology, and is the most disrupted of all attachment patterns. And when we look at the behaviors that are associated with insecure attachment in the different domains, then we see the behaviors that are associated with people who are rough sleepers, the behaviors that you encounter every day in your work with rough sleepers, and again, the behaviors that often present in mental health services. If you look at these symptoms of personality disorder, then you come across the same set of characteristics of disturbed attachment patterns. So what we're dealing with are behaviors that are determined by disrupted early attachment patterns. Not, they're called challenging behaviors. It may be quite challenging for us to work with them, but actually for the people who are experiencing them, this is the result of disrupted early attachment. And these adverse childhood events and disrupted early attachment has a huge impact through life. This is taken from Filitti's study on adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and the adoption of high-risk behaviors, the behaviors that challenge society, challenge institutions, challenge schools, challenge services, and that are very challenging to experience yourself. Of course, it's not comfortable to live in these places. And they lead to disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. And in Britain, we're talking about people who die while living on the streets or in hostels with an age in their early 40s or late 30s for women. And the effects of adverse childhood events are extraordinary. So this, on a study of 17,000 people, there is a correlation between adverse childhood experiences. The more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are to suffer from depression, suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, promiscuity, domestic violence, smoking, obesity, inactivity, sexually transmitted diseases, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, fractures, and liver disease. Pretty much everything. And mental health problems. Pretty much everything. There's a psychologist said to me once that there's only one diagnosis, and that's bad life disorder. And you have a difficult start in life. These are the side effects. So the processes of social exclusion begin with adverse childhood experiences, with broken homes and abuse leading to disturbed attachments, which lead to disturbed and disturbing behaviors, which then challenge the authorities and challenge the society in which the people live, and then the society tends to attack back. Disturbed and disturbing behaviors lead to further disruption, often to broken families, and the children leaving early in school, with truanting, with expulsions and exclusions, and with the authorities, and with people getting into difficulties with the criminal justice system. Children and youth are often further excluded through children's services. They're taken out of their familiar places and put into institutions. They often experience bullying and abuse in the institutions, and they get involved with the criminal justice system because they do criminal damage, they drink, they take drugs. They often mask the pain and injustice of social exclusion with drugs and alcohol, and they then get socially excluded because they take drugs and alcohol, and they get excluded from services, and they're considered to be bad. This is from a psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a child psychiatrist. Being harmed by the people who are supposed to love you, being abandoned by them, being robbed of the one-on-one relationships that allow you to feel safe and valued and to become humane. These are profoundly destructive experiences because humans are inescapably social beings. The worst catastrophe that can befall us inevitably involve relational loss. And what he said, which I think says a lot for rough sleeping, particularly, is the most traumatic aspect of all disasters involve the shattering of human connections. And rough sleeping is perhaps the most evident and explicit form of social exclusion in our society. There are people who are in the street with busy cities going on all around them, and everybody walks past them. It's as if they're not there. They're invisible within a city, within a lot of people. And you're much lonelier when you're in a crowd and nobody will speak to you and nobody will have anything. People try to avoid looking at them. I remember a rough sleeper in London saying to me, the difference between me and the black bin bags that I sit in is that somebody comes for the black bin bags. It wasn't quite accurate because actually outreach teams came for him as well and he pushed them away all the time. But social exclusion as a rough sleeper is almost absolute. And we look at the effects of social exclusion. This, you won't be able to see the details, but the red bit is the effect on morbidity and mortality, so the amount of disease and the probability of death. And the effect size on social exclusion is greater than the dark blue, which is smoking, the greeny yellow which is alcohol consumption, on cardiac rehabilitation. So the biggest effect on morbidity and mortality, so on illness and on death, is social exclusion. It's worse than any of the big public health things of smoking, obesity, and alcohol. So social exclusion is a process which begins in infancy or early childhood, and it is done to an individual. It happens to people. It is an act of people and institutions around them. It's an act of families and societies under the influence of wider social determinants of poverty and inequality and poor housing conditions and so on. It's a process which involves damaged attachment patterns and compound trauma. And the behaviors of homeless people and rough sleepers, especially the long-term chronic homeless, can be understood in terms of social injustice, social exclusion, damaged attachment, and compound trauma. The blame is still often laid at the doors of the rough sleepers themselves. They're called hard to engage, or that they've somehow made some sort of lifestyle choice. I think it's not that. So I'd like to look a little bit at compound trauma. There's an enormous amount of evidence of the links between homelessness and trauma, and especially long-term homelessness and rough sleeping. And there's much less formal study done on attachment and homelessness, which is why I hope Elias Barato is going to publish his research soon. These are various studies done in London. These are international studies on homelessness and trauma from America, Australia, Europe, America again. That's one that was done fairly recently in Ireland. There's a lot of studies have been done on the relationship between trauma and rough sleeping and homelessness, high levels of trauma in the homeless population. Take a little look at what trauma is. Trauma, these are the dictionary definitions, and trauma is an event that evokes feelings of intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Or another definition is an inescapably stressful event that overwhelms people's coping mechanisms. And I think that's an important thought, that overwhelms people's coping mechanisms. I can't take this anymore. And one of the things that we do when we can't take it anymore is withdraw. We run away and we hide. We withdraw from social interactions and we move ourselves away from the situation. And just walking out and becoming a rough sleeper is part of that. And a sense of life-threatening powerlessness. Bad combination, that is. Powerlessness is bad. We all feel frightened when we're in the face of overwhelming authority. But powerlessness in a life-threatening situation. This is an extension of the childhood trauma, of course, but it's a severe situation to be in. Your life is threatened, but there's nothing you can do about it. So this is trauma that leaves disruption in our bodies and our minds. And post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm not going to go into differences between those, the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation, I would say, or violation. It's not just sexual violation, it's violation of our boundaries. If somebody comes up and screams in your face or punches you in the face, that's a violation of your boundaries and it's traumatizing. And exposure is when the individual directly experiences the traumatic event or witnesses it. And we often don't think of trauma as being around traumatic events, but for children, seeing their parents fight, seeing their mother being beaten up by their father, that sort of thing, is traumatizing. Even though they're not hit themselves, they often are hit as well. So it's experiencing the traumatic event or witnessing a traumatic event, including you, of course. You witness quite a lot of traumatic events, I expect, if you're working with rough sleepers. And trauma can be triggered by a single event, or it can be enduring and ongoing, or repeated again and again over time. And that's what I call compound trauma, sometimes referred to as complex trauma. But I think if we call it complex, it makes it more difficult to think about. But if we call it compound, it's quite easy to understand. It's trauma, and then another trauma, and then another trauma, and then another trauma. And before you've had time to recover from it, there's another trauma. So when we think about our homeless, our rough sleepers, with their early experience of adverse childhood trauma events and early childhood trauma, and then we think of what goes on afterwards. So having lost their childhoods, they lose their home, and just being homeless, that's a trauma. If you imagine, don't spend too long on this because it's not a nice thing to imagine, but if you imagine that you go home when your house has burnt down and there's nothing there at all, that's traumatic. Being without a home is traumatic. You lose your parents, other significant people. I remember doing surveys with rough sleepers when I worked at St Mungo's in London, and you would ask for the next of kin in case anything happened to them. The number who said no next of kin. They had no relatives, nobody to be notified if they died. The loss of opportunities, being rough sleeper, being homeless, makes it very difficult to take up all the other things that are available to most people, to the housed population. The loss of health, and there is a correlation between rough sleeping and ill health, obviously, you all know this. Studies have been done showing that even a week or 2 weeks of rough sleeping begins to have a quite serious effect on people's health. The loss of self-esteem and self-confidence. And how difficult is it to rebuild your life when you've lost your dignity and you're living on the street and people treat you with contempt and look at you with contempt all the time? And you smell and you're dirty and you disgust yourself, you disgust everybody else. Very difficult place to be living in. And that's compound trauma. But on top of that, rough sleepers experience a lot of violence and bullying on the street, and there are a lot of attacks. This guy having his face stitched up was from a rough sleeper who was kicked by a group of youths who came and attacked him. Sexual violence, over 30% of women report sexual violence on the street. Again, that's probably underreported. Injuries, just because living on the street is difficult and dangerous, and people injure, they fall over, they get hurt, and they don't get them attended to. They wear shoes that are wrong size, their nails get pushed off, that sort of thing. Death, they witness death, they see friends die. They see people die violently, they see people die of treatable health conditions. They suffer random attacks, and they have violence in institutions. So they get brought into a hostel and they get attacked in the hostel. They get put into prison, they get attacked in prison. There's violence and trauma all around, on top of these other traumas that they've had. So we have a picture of high levels of compound trauma with low levels of attachment, low secure attachment, so low levels of relationships. If I'm traumatized, if something horrible happens to me, then I have friends, I have family who come and they treat me really nicely and they're very kind to me and they help me recover. If you're socially excluded and you experience high levels of compound trauma, you don't have that network to enable you to recover from the trauma. You just go on experiencing the trauma all the time and you react accordingly. And it impacts you on many, many different levels. It results in damaging, chaotic behavior because you're in a state of hyper-arousal and you're reacting to life-threatening, powerless situations all the time. It has physiological damage because you suffer from panic attacks, hyperarousal, sweating, heightened stress responses, which put a big toll on your body. Your whole immune system and all your physiological systems are on hyper alert all the time. It becomes difficult to regulate emotions because you've got all these unprocessed, traumatized emotions inside you. And so you suddenly get really angry about something which is just irritating to most people, but then you shout and you smash things and you break things and then you get excluded again. It gives you what are called mental health problems because you're in very high level of unresolved distress. And it gives you relational problems. It becomes very difficult to trust people. You get afraid of getting close to people or becoming intimate with people because it only results in loss. Or you get very clingy to people. If somebody does show some kindness, you demand more and more and more and more because there's never been enough for you. And it gives you social problems because you don't want to join in groups because they've always been dangerous and you know you'll get excluded. You seek social isolation. You're defensive or aggressive to defend yourself. To protect yourself, you attack first. So it gives a lot of problems on a lot of levels. And it gives rise to what we call technically multiple morbidity, where people have mental health problems, physical health problems, and drug and alcohol problems together. And this is another sample of rough sleepers taken by St Mungo's outreach team some years ago. Whew. It was okay? Yeah, it was okay with me. It's difficult, I think it's difficult to think about the level of trauma and the level of experience of people who are rough sleeping. It's a really difficult place to be for people. And it's very difficult to get out of because it's internalized. So I want to look at psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed care because both come with the idea of enabling organizations who work with rough sleepers and homeless people to work more effectively with people who've been deeply traumatized. So just a bit of background on trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care it developed in the USA over the last 30, 50 years. And it's got two sources, and it's sort of kind of unclear. It seems to have grown organically from these two sources. But clinicians working with ex-servicemen from the Vietnam War came up with the idea of trauma-informed care because they were working, obviously, with a population that was deeply traumatized. And their principle was that if somebody is in a state of fear, that lots of the average age of Americans killed in Vietnam was 19. Yeah, so these were young kids sent out to fight a war that they didn't want to fight against their will because they were conscripted, most of them. And they came back deeply traumatized, having watched a large number of, well, obviously the difficulties of war, but also quite a lot of abuse that was carried out by the American army there. And they came back traumatized to a society that didn't want to recognize them because the Americans really struggled with the idea that they lost the war and they couldn't actually admit that. They had to impeach Nixon and everything and so on. But anyway, so the idea was to create safety, a sense of safety. And that was where the beginning of the clinician's idea of trauma-informed care was. If somebody is hyper-aroused with fear, then what you need to do is create a space of safety, because the only thing that switches off our fear instinct is safety. We get to a place of safety, we calm down, our nervous system goes back to a more stable state. And then also ex-patients of mental health services, and particularly the survivors movement. So the people, the anti-psychiatry movement of the 70s led to another version of trauma-informed care, which was a fight back in a way of their illness had been medicalized, and they were told that they were ill and that they had a problem and that it was their individual problem and that they had disturbances of their brain systems and so on and so forth. And they were treated like that and they were given medication and it was all their fault, whereas actually they're saying we have experienced trauma. We had adverse childhood experiences, we had traumatic events in our life, And that is why we have mental health problems. And so they invented trauma-informed care as well. It developed out of that, saying that what they needed looking after was, again, their fear and their fight responses because of having experienced trauma. So those are the roots of the trauma-informed care movement. And as a result of that those roots, it's often political as well as being a service delivery aspect. And the political aspect sees the struggle and the resolution of trauma as one of social justice. And that's true whether the client group are homeless people, people experiencing mental health problems, or trauma-informed care is quite big in women fleeing gender-based violence as well. These are all victims of oppression and inequality in our society, and that trauma can be understood as an outcome of this oppression because poor people, because people, children, because women are oppressed, because they are victims of violence in this society, which is structured in a way that allows that, then they become traumatized. And trauma is an inevitable result of the social injustice. That's one of the theses. So affirming the socio-political context is part of the recovery process. Which is essentially saying this isn't your fault. This isn't because there's something wrong with you. This has been done to you because society is unjust. And I think that's important. I think that's important for all the people who are out there and who get treated as if they are the problem. They are the product of the problems of society. People experiencing homelessness and people experiencing mental health problems and women fleeing gender-based violence also, though, have individual histories of compound trauma going back into their early childhood and their infancies. They're impacted by social and personal discourses of trauma and of oppression, as well and the biopsychosocial processes of internalization of trauma and oppression. So they internalize a model of trauma and they reenact victimhood, and they find themselves in repetitive situations of victimhood in a victimizing society. And although the roots of the client's experience of trauma may lie in social and political systems, they're infected by their individual histories and circumstances, and they will usually present them as individual histories and circumstances rather than politicizing them. I think it's helpful for people to understand the political context of it, but it is still a very individual story. When you experience compound trauma, it's personal. It's about you and your relationships and your story. So the experience of trauma accompanied by damaged and damaging attachment experiences has a significant impact on how people act and respond here and now, because they're coming to you from a very different mental state. So we're in a mental state, and you're probably in, I don't know how many people are here, lots of you. You have lots of mental states between you, but all hopefully reasonably stable. You got up this morning, hopefully in a reasonably comfortable space, didn't have too many arguments with your nearest and dearest before you got here and so on. So you're in a particular space, but the people that you're working with are coming from a very different experience, a daily experience. They're coming from an experience of life which is probably different to the majority of yours, which is not to say that the majority of you haven't suffered trauma, because I'm sure you have, but they may have suffered more, they've suffered more frequently, and they've suffered with less support. They will be behaving in ways that are appropriate for that situation. So the political and social injustices become enacted in myriads of individual behaviors and ways of interacting that are the so-called challenging behaviors, the things we saw about insecure attachment, the difficulty to engage, the engage and then run away, the inattendance, the ambivalence, violence, aggression, abusive language, withdrawing, hiding, not turning up, things like that. These are behaviors which are dictated by how the person feels and how they have learned to respond to an environment which is hostile to them. So psychologically informed environments came about. It was a set of principles developed in the UK by a group comprising psychologists, psychotherapists, which, including myself, a commissioner who was the government advisor on rough sleeping, and social workers and managers of homelessness services. And they came together to enable staff to work with rough sleepers, to work with really traumatized people, because we're working with homelessness agencies. They know about working with homeless people and rough sleepers. They know a lot about that. And they would instinctively know some tremendously good ways of working with people. They're good at relationships on the whole. But they had no clinical training, no training in trauma, and no real understanding of why people were behaving in the way they were and the impact it was having on them. So the idea of psychologically informed environments was to provide a set of principles that would enable the staff to work more effectively and more safely, so that they don't become too traumatized themselves, with people affected by trauma, and particularly affected by compound trauma. So it was set up as a staff support system, and it provides a clear framework for delivering trauma-informed care. So psychologically informed environments, I'm going to talk about a little bit as a method of delivering trauma-informed care and working with people with damaged attachments and experiences of compound trauma. And it's been used in a lot of places now that I know of. These are ones that I know of. So it's been implemented, psychologically informed environments framework, in homelessness hostels, in assessment centres, in street outreach teams, in day centres and in reception centres, in women's refuges, in a specialist accommodation service for drug-dependent women involved in street prostitution, in women's homelessness hostels, children's homes, young people's services, mental health services, crisis houses, registered care homes, homeless family units, mother and baby units, and housing option teams, so that's local authority housing teams, have all used the psychologically informed environments approach to change the way they work so that they can work more effectively with trauma, and so that the staff are less affected by trauma themselves. And the impact of implementing psychologically informed environments in all of those different situations. So I would say this is an impact of implementing PI. It doesn't matter where you implement it, you get these results. You get a reduction in the number of incidents, i.e. the number of incidents of violence, aggression, and so on. You get less trouble, as it were. You get less evictions and barrings, which stems from having less incidents, so less people are excluded. And when it comes down to it, it's one of the worst things possible, isn't it, is that services that are set up to work with the socially excluded exclude people. So a reduction in exclusions is really, really important. You get an increase in positive move-on, because the people, the positive move-on is not achieved by us. We provide the kind of the groundwork for positive move-on, but it's actually the rough sleeper themselves who does the positive move-on. You get an increase in positive move-on because they begin to rebuild some self-esteem. You get a reduction in hospitalizations and the use of emergency care. That's very important to be working with health services, and actually people don't normally get the very best health care in emergency situations. You get an increased uptake of other services, so people engage with employment, training, and other opportunities. They begin to take up opportunities, because as their self-esteem rises and as their fear goes down, they're more able to. If you're frightened and somebody comes along and starts talking to you about applying for a job, you just don't bother, do you? I mean, you wouldn't. I'm frightened. I'm trying to stay alive here. Do you want a job? No, you know. You get an improvement in mental well-being and resilience in your rough sleepers, but also in the staff. And that's really important. The staff start to feel better about themselves. They feel better about the work they're doing. They feel more effective. They feel less traumatized. They suffer from less burnout. The staff morale goes up. They feel we're actually doing something here that is noticed, because they're noticing that they are being supported by senior staff and senior managers. You get a reduction in sickness and staff turnover, and you get an improvement in manager-staff relations. Because otherwise, the them and us, you get the staff siding with the rough sleepers, and there becomes a them and us between the staff and management, and that gets passed all the way through the organisation. You end up with a traumatised organisation. But PI isn't a model to apply, so there isn't a thing, you must do this, you must do that, you must do, because it can be applied in so many different situations. It's a set of principles which guides the design and the development of services. And it guides them in such a way that they'll be better able to engage and work with people in distress who are experiencing or have experienced compound trauma. And most of the people you work with are experiencing ongoing compound trauma. And the principles provide a framework for creating trauma-sensitive services to people in distress in a multiplicity of situations. So it is possible, and in an ideal world it happens, is that the homelessness services are psychologically informed environments, and they work with psychologically informed mental health services and health services and so on. And I know that there are some psychologically informed psychiatric and mental health teams. There are some psychologically informed GPs practices who have used PI to develop a psychologically informed GPs practice and so on, as well as housing departments who've used psychologically informed environments, so that a person can have an experience in which it's recognized where they're coming from, damaged attachment and compound trauma, in all these different institutions. And it's actually both simple and difficult to implement psychologically informed environments. It's difficult because all work with human beings, especially with human beings in distress, is difficult. It depends on your personal relationships. But there are a set of principles of psychologically informed environments. There were 5 in the original guidance that we published 10, 11 years ago now. And they've gone up to 7 now. But if you do something, and it depends on your organisation, it depends on your situation, it depends on what you're working with, whether you're a day centre or an outreach team or a hostel or a mental health service or a health practice. It depends what you are, what actual thing you do, but a psychological framework. So some understanding of attachment and trauma and human developmental processes and how they work. So an understanding of the basic fundamental biological drives, which are, for example, attachment, caregiving and care seeking. Both sides need to be enacted. It's no good just having care seeking from your clients. You need to give them opportunities to give care as well, so that they can take responsibility, because it's a two-way thing, attachment. The fear, fight, flight, and freeze system, which is a fundamental biological drive. So some understanding of how that works and of how you can calm people down, how safety, emotional, psychological, physical safety will reduce people's fear response, which enables social engagement, social interaction, and thinking. We depress our cognitive process. We stop thinking in emergency situations, because if you're being attacked by a tiger, you don't want to sit there and think, now what do tigers eat? Let me think. You need to act really, really fast. So you cross out all that prefrontal cortex stuff, you get rid of all that, and you just act. It's where people are in the fight, in the threat situations. So you need a psychological framework to understand that, and there are various from different forms of psychology. You need a staff support system. And the central one of staff support, I think, is reflective practice, is that you have a formal time where the staff come together and they can think about what they're doing, how they work. They have a little space to express their own feelings and how it's impacting on them and how the work impacts on them. So the team, it helps the team bond, it helps the team recognize each other's difficulty and work more as a team. But it also allows the expression of that, because otherwise the distress builds up and starts getting acted out in little pockets. So staff support, good supervision helps. I say this, but it is actually important to staff that they're paid well as the organisation can afford them. When I took over an organisation, the first thing I did was actually put the staff pay up, partly because that's to curry favour as a chief executive, but it's also because it's really important. The staff are the most important things. Managing relationships is central, and that's what a psychologically informed environment is about at its very least. It's about managing relationships, not just having relationships, but thinking about them and think about all the different relationships. So there's a relationship between your staff and your clients, the rough sleepers and homeless people you work with, a relationship between the staff and each other, between the staff and their managers, the managers and the staff, between the managers and middle managers and senior managers, between them and the mental health services and the housing services. And all those relationships benefit from being managed, thinking about them, what is going on, what is important for this person, what's happening for that person. Let's try and make this team work better. Let's work with them. How do you get your mental health services on board? What do they need? What do they need from this situation? How can you facilitate that? How can you form a personal relationship with them? Likewise with your housing department. What do they need to be able to house your person? How do you enable that? How do you have a personal relationship with them? Things work much better through personal relationships, as I'm sure you all know. But if you're consciously managing all these relationships, things will go better, and consciously managing the relationship. Your relationship with the rough sleeper, when you're a frontline member of staff, is the biggest tool you've got to enable that person to make the changes in their life that only they can make. You can't make them change. You can present opportunities to them, but what you can do is make them feel like it's worthwhile changing, because they get the idea that you care about them and you're there for them and that they've got some support. Social spaces, what message is given by the spaces that you work from or in? What sort of message is given when you go take somebody into a building, into a service? I remember days, they're not so common nowadays, where you had double airlocks and you had to go through this first one, and then you were sort of not quite hosed down and disinfected before you could go through the next. People who are behind screens, very official things, sitting behind a desk and a computer and the other person's there. Big chairs, little chairs, all sorts of things that express power. But if somebody is traumatized and has been the victim of abusive power all their lives, you have to be really, 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 really careful about how you express power. Do you have loads of rules and regulations when people come into a building? There was a hostel in St Mungo's when I worked there, and it had this big sign saying, appropriate footwear must be worn at all times. And nobody knew what it meant. What was appropriate footwear for a hostel? Nobody even knew where that sign came from. It had been there for years. But that sort of institutional stuff happens, and much more common. If you drink, you'll be chucked out. If you swear, you'll be chucked out. If you do that. Access to psychotherapists and psychotherapy. And for some people who are deeply traumatized, it's really, really helpful to have psychotherapy. And if you can get access to psychotherapy, that's really helpful, especially when people begin to want to make a recovery. It's a place where they can begin to process some of the really difficult experiences. It also protects frontline staff from hearing about really difficult experiences that they're not trained and supported to listen to, because people who have been multiply abused, have had really serious childhood abuse, that sort of trauma, if they pour it out on your frontline workers, the frontline workers will get traumatized. They haven't got anywhere to take it. They haven't necessarily got enough internal resources to process it. Psychotherapists have done years and years of therapy, and they can cope with it. It's their job, it's their role to cope with it. So it's helpful. It also gives you somebody who can facilitate reflective practice. If your organization has a psychotherapist or a psychologist on tap, you've got somebody to provide some training to support the psychological framework and to facilitate your reflective practice groups. Lots of organizations manage to find some funding for psychologists and psychotherapists. Lots of organizations don't and use charitable funding. Lots of organizations strike deals with their health services or with their local mental health services. Some do with training and with colleges and things like that. People by hook or by crook get this involved, but it really helps to have access to psychologists or psychotherapists. Client involvement and participation is obviously really important because you're trying to enable people, then you have to give them some responsibility and you have to give them some respect, and giving people respect is allowing them to do things, trusting them to do things. The organisation I work in now works with people with diagnoses of mental health problems, mainly personality disorders and psychosis. Most of them have been hospitalised for a long time. We have high levels of self-harm. But people they cook for themselves. They cook for each other. They cook together as a group and they eat as a group. They have big kitchen knives. And people say, you shouldn't let them have kitchen knives. Of course you have to. Allow people the responsibility to take responsibility for themselves. What you say to them is, I trust you. You're enabling people to feel trusted. That's really valuable. They will begin to trust themselves. So client involvement and participation as far as you can in whatever service you can and as far as the client can, because some people can't. And some people can't cook, for example, and it's because they've never done that and they've got a long way to go to learn. So it's something that will be progressive. It was something that will develop. But as people go along, they are equals. And therefore they have to have equal roles at some point. They want to be caregivers as well as care seekers. It's an important part of attachment. And finally, evaluation. And I think evaluation, you probably have to be evaluated for various ways of getting funding and so on. You like to be evaluated because you like to say, we have achieved this, that, and the other. But I think of this in the personal sense of being a reflective practitioner, being a worker, evaluating yourself. Think about what you do. And this also, if you have the opportunity of reflective groups, this is something to do in your team groups, is how did we do there? What went well? What didn't go so well? That interaction I had with that person, I said that and they got really upset. Why was it that they got so upset about that? What is it that I don't know about them that made them get upset about this thing that I did, that I intended quite well? What was it about me that got up their nose, that made them really upset and so on? And evaluating yourself, that went really well. What did I do that time? Oh, and trying to work out what you're actually doing with your team, in yourselves, is really, really helpful because you become reflective and thinking, and it creates a space. It also calms down trauma because we have the autonomous nervous system, and it's got the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Don't worry about that. But one side has the fear response, and the other side has social engagement and thinking and so on. If you stay in the social engagement and thinking side, you're breathing, you're calm, you're thoughtful, you're interacting, and you're interacting with somebody, not reacting to them, but responding thoughtfully and carefully, that will calm them down. That will change their physiological responses. It will help to de-traumatize them. You speak slowly. When somebody shouts at you, speak quietly, and that sort of thing. If you get excited back, then it just carries on the trauma cycle. So if you do something in each of these 7 domains, you create a psychologically informed environment. And it's not a thing that, we've done that, okay, now we can go on to the next thing. It's an ongoing process. It's a dynamic process, like attachment. So you keep working on these things, and it creates an environment in which trauma is likely to be reduced. So you will have a reduction in incidents and a reduction of evictions. You will improve your move on. You will reduce the emergency care use. You'll get better uptake of other services. You'll get an improvement in staff well-being, an improvement in staff morale, a reduction in sickness, and improved manager-staff relations. All these things flow from it. And your senior managers can measure it all and get very excited about it. But what you're doing is something under each of those headings. And these are a few resources which I think you'll get the slides, so you'll be able to find some of those things. There's more things. And I just want to finish with an example of an organisation called St Basil's, which is, works with young homeless people in Birmingham in the UK, and their experience of implementing psychologically informed environments. These were the things that they identified as being really important and useful to them when they were implementing psychologically informed environments. Being clear about the task and the outcomes they wanted to achieve, getting involvement from their service users, from the young people they worked with, and from the staff early on, so that they began with discussions of what psychologically informed environments were, why they were needed, what trauma was, how you worked with it, and so on. And they had those discussions not just with their staff, but also with the people that they worked with. So that there was a consensus around this being an important conversation and something that the organisation wanted to do. It has to be core business. It's not an add-on. It's not a new thing that you just add to this, and this is something. It is central to the organisation. The organisation needs to want to become psychologically informed, trauma-informed, because it's a whole organisation approach. You're creating an environment in which trauma can decrease so that the person's experience becomes a more positive experience of life, which they can then use to take out into other areas of their own lives and which they can take with them. So you need explicit buy-in from your senior managers and your senior staff and managers. And that's really important because in lots of organisations, I think the frontline staff understand about trauma, and they get it because they work with it all the time. And the middle managers and the seniors don't believe that it applies to them, and the organisations around them don't believe it. But it does, of course. If you've got a senior management who are imposing tight controls and have a kind of punitive approach to staff management, then you can't run a trauma-informed organisation because it's traumatizing to work in that way. Balancing consistency with innovation, and what they meant by that was that the staff know an enormous amount about psychologically informed working. They know a lot about trauma. They know a huge amount, on the whole, about managing relationships. They have lots of skills that they bring to it. So it wasn't about saying, right, we're doing something completely different now. It was about thinking what you do, what is the best things that you do that are most effective, and then using those and building on those and drawing those up through the organisation. And implementing reflective practice sessions with a clear implementation and sustainability strategy. So when I introduced psychologically informed environments, or we introduced it at St Mungo's, big organisation with loads and loads of services, we had, I think, it's well over 200 different services, and it started off with an hour of reflective practice, hour and a half of reflective practice per service per month. Well, that was fine with 1 or 2 services. Then when we had 200, so it was only a small amount of money for one, but when you multiply anything by 200, it starts getting a lot of noughts on the end. But it's really, really important. So you have to build it in. So we built it into the budgets. It's still not a lot of money when you look at it in the overall cost of a service, but it has to be built in. You've got to build in time for your staff. And that's really important. Time is a really important thing in working with people who are traumatized. You know, working with rough sleepers takes time. You have to have time for reflective practice. And a sustainability strategy. Who's going to facilitate it? Where are you going to get it from? Where's the money coming from? You embed psychologically informed approaches in all areas of work. You make it a standard part of induction, and you have regular refresher sessions, because 2-day training and then that's it. And then 5 years later, most of your staff are completely different staff. You can't sustain anything like that. So you have to do regular training and make it part of induction so people know they're coming into a psychologically informed organisation. And you recognise the skills required and provide a coherent framework. So providing the psychological framework is part of the support of implementing it from senior staff. So they need to have a concept of what a coherent framework is. So that's what St Basil's found when they implemented it. And these were the outcomes. This in the first year, a 13% reduction in incidents, 31% reduction in notice to quit for behavioural issues, so 31% reduction in exclusions. That's huge. 19% reduction in unplanned departures, so that 20% less people just abandoned because they felt heard and they got noticed, they felt cared for. A 26% reduction in sickness absence. That's like having an extra member of staff for every 4 members of staff that you've got. It's like increasing your workforce by 25% for nothing. And a 7% reduction in grievance and disciplinary actions. And they found that the staff were more able to engage with the young people they were working with. They had a better understanding of compound trauma. They were more proactive in de-escalating challenging behavior. So they didn't allow challenging behavior to get to the extent where it becomes criminal damage or violence, and therefore people get excluded. The staff felt more confident and more competent to work with the problematic behavior, and the staff had more creative strategies for achieving positive outcomes. All in the first year of implementing PI. And then you had a huge increase in engagement with other services in primary care, with substance use services. Within 18 months, 62%, 75% of alcohol users engaged in treatment. Astonishing figures, really. The evictions as a rate of percentage of departures dropped, higher move-ons. So they had an improvement on every single access across a range of staff and organisational measures, across belonging, boundaries, communication, development, involvement, structure, empowerment. It was just better all round. And they've got some fantastic stuff on their website, and they're hopefully writing a couple of chapters for me for a next book. So, in summary, the PI outcomes, good for staff and good for rough sleepers. So psychologically informed environments provides a way of working in trauma-informed way, working with damaged attachment and compound trauma that we find in rough sleepers. And the staff say PI helps to develop positive, supportive and constructive relationships. And the rough sleepers say, living here has definitely changed me. I'm starting to be glad I'm here and not wanting to be dead, that's a huge step forward in life. Not wanting to be dead is just the most important thing. Once you've done that, I think, I don't want to be dead. Then you have to start thinking about how you're going to live. And that's fantastic. So that's it. Thank you. Right.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Ha sido un privilegio escucharte. Yo creo que a partir de ahora vamos a hablar mucho de este pie, ¿no? De este entorno psicológicamente informado, que para nosotros es muy importante, ¿no? En el modelo de intervención en el que estamos años y años intentando como estructurarlo bien, y nos va a hacer ser de mucha ayuda en nuestras reuniones y en nuestra práctica. Jo crec que com ens ha quedat minutos, ens ha quedat temps, seria un bon moment com per preguntar-li y poder conversar contigo. Seguro que hay muchas preguntas. ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿No? Yo veo aquí sonrisas de cómo lo vamos a hacer, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a implementar este entorno psicológicamente informado?
Yo no sé cómo.
¿Cómo podemos hacer para no sentirnos nosotros también, ¿no? traumados en la intervención? ¿Cómo podemos autoayudarnos? ¿No hay preguntas, en serio? Segur que sí. A veure, aquí tenim les Laies, no? Sí. ¿Què, sí? No. ¿No hi ha preguntes?
Hola. Bueno, me interesaba a la hora de implementar esta forma de trabajar, ¿no? Me preguntaba si esto se hizo de manera aislada en centros, o sea, si los datos de evaluación y todo esto que has mostrado si era una cosa, o sea, si esto se implementó en muchos lugares a la vez o fueron iniciativas particulares que luego se han ido evaluando, porque no sé, como que da la sensación de que para que esto funcione, ¿no? O sea, que seguro que funciona a nivel en un lugar concreto, ¿no? Pero que debería haber como una coordinación y una apuesta o sea, pues, una apuesta porque todos los diferentes sectores que trabajamos con personas en Sesostre, ¿no? Podamos coordinarnos para que vaya mucho más allá, ¿no? Porque nosotros, por ejemplo, trabajamos en un centro de salud que estamos empezando ahora a pensar un poco en esto, ¿no? Pero pues nos faltan muchos pies, ¿no? Pues el apoyo psicológico no depende de nosotros, depende del centro de salud mental, bueno, toda una serie de cosas, ¿no? Que, bueno, me interesaba ver cómo la evaluación cómo había sido y si se había hecho una cosa, un proyecto así más en varios lugares a la vez.
Okay, shall I answer that, or first of all? Yes. Yep. Okay. Can we do it all at once? And what about all the other organisations around us and all the people we work with? That's the question. I think you have to it's a sort of culture change process. So introducing something like psychologically informed environments, as I say, it builds on what you already do. So you're looking at what is most effective about what you do and the way that you work now and the knowledge and skills that you already have. But if you do something in all of those areas, when you're trying to change an organization, it actually works much better, instead of doing one big thing, to do lots of small things. And that is much more sustainable and is much more effective, and you can take people with you. So you take your staff and your clients with you and your management. So, as I say, if you take actions in each of those domains, but you have to think about what is appropriate to you. And I mean, one of the obvious examples is social spaces, and thinking about the spaces in which you work is quite different if you're a street outreach team and if you're running a residential service. And you can think quite differently. If it's a residential service, obviously you can move furniture, you can paint things, you can knock things down and build them up. If you're in a street outreach team, how do you manage the street environment? But there's still things you can do about creating a little bit of privacy, a little bit of safety, a little sense of how do you protect that space of your interaction with the person you're working with to make it possible for you to have a private conversation or to have an intimate conversation. So there are still things you can do. In terms of working with other people, you think about the managing relationships bit. It depends on the other people. Sometimes you have partner agencies who are really helpful, and you can have a conversation with them about becoming trauma-informed and about how you might work together in a trauma-informed way. Sometimes you're working with partner agencies who are quite unhelpful, actually, who are quite difficult and who put obstacles in the way rather than trying to enable things. And then you have to think, how do you manage that relationship? Where are they coming from? What's their problem? What is it that you can do to get the best out of them? Which is, and that you come up with what's called a wicked problem, where there's two solutions, one is bad and one is worse. And quite often, and unfortunately, because we work in bad systems and an unjust society, you're dealing with a wicked problem rather than with a problem which has a wonderful solution. You're thinking, what is less bad? What is what can I get out of this? So it's managing each one, but I think each area has to be given individual thought according to the organization you're working with and the situation you'll find yourself in, and has to be reviewed all the time because it changes. And you get a service which is really unhelpful, and then it has a change of manager, and suddenly you can have a decent relationship with them, especially if you get new managers in quick from outside services. There are things you can do. Yeah. So that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Sí, hola, buen día. Yo quería preguntar sobre, bueno, si podría ampliar un poco la información sobre la práctica reflexiva. He estado comentando que cuando empiezan a utilizar estos principios se hace una hora de práctica reflexiva. Entonces, conocer un poco cómo se aplica, ¿no? De qué forma se establece esta hora, esta práctica. Gracias.
La práctica reflexiva. Okay. Well, there are lots of different forms of reflective practice, and different organisations adopt them. Some are a little bit more like supervision. Some are kind of based on learning. My preferred model, the one we use in my organisation, in the previous organisations I've worked in, is a more open, reflective group. I think the key thing is, for any of them, is that you have to have a space set aside and a time set aside. So you need a space without interruptions. Usually a minimum frequency is about once a month. Because we work with very high levels of trauma in the organisation I work with now, active, ongoing trauma, a lot of people who attempt suicide and self-harm quite severely. We have weekly reflective practice for the staff, but it's the important thing is that there's a space and a time set aside where they won't be interrupted, and where you have an outside facilitator. It's not 100% necessary to have an outside facilitator, but it helps, because obviously the other person is part of the team and part of the group dynamic. So for people to talk openly and honestly, it's not usually helpful for it to be run by the manager, for example. Sometimes, some groups, you just have staff and the managers have their own group. Some organizations, you have staff and managers. Where I work now, we have the staff, the manager, and the psychologist who works in that particular team, all part of the reflective group, and somebody else facilitates it. But that's the key thing, is that regularity, protected time, protected space where it's uninterrupted, if at all possible, facilitated. And the aim of it is for the staff to explore what the impact, the personal impact of their work on themselves and on the team. And it's to go through team dynamics, the way the team works together, and the difficult things that people have, you know, and you can do that individually, but it's better as a group. It's a shared experience and shared knowledge, and there's lots of evidence that it protects against vicarious trauma, i.e. secondary trauma. So it stops the staff getting so traumatized and being so affected by some of the difficult experiences. And I think all of you who work with rough sleepers will have had very difficult experiences sometimes. It is really emotionally difficult work. So, yeah.
Bueno, en primer lloc, Peter, moltes gràcies per la xerrada, que m'ha agradat molt. Jo soc metge de família i treballo al mateix centre de la companya que ha intervingut abans. I bueno, una de les preguntes que em ressonava al llarg de l'exposició, perquè en un centre d'atenció primària a vegades pot passar que tu treballes amb la població que accedeix dins del centre, però a vegades, no? Ara una de les coses que estem reflexionant, no? De gent que viu o passa de manera transitòria pel barri on nosaltres donem atenció, com podem apropar-nos, no, a aquesta població. I una de les coses que em preguntava, ja sé que potser és una pregunta molt bàsica, però quines són les barreres que més percep aquesta població a l'hora de, per exemple, accedir a un servei d'atenció primària o hospitalària, d'una atenció sanitària en general?
¿Qué es la pregunta?
Sorry. Like, what are the barriers that this population feel when they want to, like, kind of come to our...
¿Cuáles son las barreras?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was right. I wasn't sure.
Thank
you. There's... there are a lot of barriers. There's past experience. We tend to, with the way human mind works, we respond to what we think is going to happen. It's much quicker and more effective than responding to what is actually happening, because if we wait and see what's happening, you've got to see it, think it, process it, work out a good response, and then respond. So something looks like it's likely to happen, and then you respond. You duck when something comes flying towards you. You don't wait and work out the trajectory. Yes, and it's called an anticipatory response. So people come to us or when they come into contact with us, it's what they expect to happen is what they're looking for. So they're expecting something probably threatening, or they're expecting to try and get something out of us, depending on the particular situation. And they're expecting not to be particularly listened to, probably. They're expecting to have somebody who comes and goes, but isn't really there for them. They're probably expecting not to have anything new offered to them. Lots of people they've tried all the things that are usually offered. They've been to hostels, that sort of thing, and they don't particularly want them. So they're sitting there with quite a lot of, or lying there with quite a lot of negative expectations about the interaction. They're also very used to being attacked, so their defensive responses are very high and hyper-aroused. So anything you suggest that gives them the impression that you're in a power situation over them will alert their fear system, and they will become more defensive. They are prepared to be insulted, to be upset, and to be outraged. Their emotions will be quite unpredictable. They may respond to you with the way that they've responded in previous situations because of the way previous things have gone, so that they will become what to you seem quite irrationally angry and so on. So there's lots of preconceptions coming, and then there's preconceptions from us about what we're doing. We're being helpful, we're being kind, we're being nice, we're making them an offer, we're trying to get them inside, we're trying to help. We're under pressure to do that. Perhaps we really want to do that. We're worried about them. We think that they might die if they stay there, and we think it's for their good that they do something. And then you've got this non-meeting of minds going on. So I think I remember when I was working years ago and worked in the front line, and I gave up smoking, and I thought, this is the end of my career in homelessness. There is no way I'm going to be able to, because the first thing I'd do is you would go sit down with a rough sleeper and offer them a cigarette, and they would take the cigarette, and you would sit down and you would just have a cigarette together. I thought, what am I going to do now? I discovered that actually you could just sit down with them and talk, and you didn't need the cigarette. I could survive without the cigarette. I still sometimes took cigarettes because they want the cigarettes, but again, giving them something. And I remember one guy who's really, 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 nobody could find what he wanted, and just by luck, he happened to mention that he was covered in fleas, and I got somebody who could come and sort out the fleas for him. It made such a difference, and he trusted me after that. I'd been helpful, you know. But it wasn't something, I don't know why he hadn't mentioned it to anybody, but he was infested with fleas. His sleeping bag was infested with fleas. Awful way to live. So I think what are we there for? Well, we go and try and do something to them, but these are people who have long histories of being done to, and so they don't necessarily want to be done. But what do they want? And just being with them. And we're often not supposed to just be with, but I think outreach workers understand this, is you spend a lot of time with somebody. Eventually you form a relationship. When you have a relationship, you can find out what makes them tick. When you understand what makes them tick, you can find some way of enabling them to come in, whether it's a housing first option or whether it's something. But it's the relationship, isn't it, that really determines that, and time. And I think if we want to form a relationship with anybody, including rough sleepers, but it's the same thing. So if you decide that you would like to make friends with somebody, or if you want to have a romantic relationship, even more so, you try and attract their attention, you try to be nice and things like that, you try to be charming, but you try to spend time with them, and you try to do things together. And that's how you build relationships, is you spend time and you do things together. And I think that's really important, is let's go along to rough sleepers, spend some time with them, and do the things that they find useful, help them with them. I don't know if that helps. So I think the barriers are in misunderstanding each other and not giving time to them as people. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Farem l'última pregunta, que toca pausa café.
Vale, mi pregunta era en relación a, bueno, nosotros trabajamos en un servicio que da atención a personas que están en la calle y que además tienen adicción y dependencias a las drogas. Entonces, en nuestro día a día nos encontramos situaciones en las que estas personas van a otros servicios, médicos, o les atienden otros agentes, ¿no? Policía o, ¿no?, otros servicios, donde reciben trato de estigma, ¿no? Reciben un trato pues, muy discriminatorio en muchos casos. Y mi pregunta es, ¿en vuestro centro os habéis encontrado mucha relación de estigma con estas personas? Y luego, ¿cuál es el impacto del estigma sobre el trauma, sobre el propio trauma de estas personas? Y por otro lado, ¿cómo trabajáis, si trabajáis vosotros en coordinación con los otros servicios para intentar manejar estas actitudes de estigma, ¿no? ¿Qué medidas tenéis para poder reducir este estigma que reciben por otros agentes, ¿no?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, there's a lot of stigma often attached to drugs and alcohol use. I think especially for women as well, for women who are homeless, there's even more stigma, I think, being a drunk woman than being a drunk man. Even in general society, it's kind of accepted. And for a lot of women, the majority of women in Britain are certainly rough sleepers, have children, had children, children have been taken away. And being a drunk mother is looked at as, is very low status in our society. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of shame. The physiological, the neurophysiological processes of shame are the same as the neurophysiological process of trauma. They overlap and they produce the same sense of personal collapse and withdrawal. People fall into the freeze mode quite often of just withdrawing emotionally and from the world. They switch off, they dissociate, they become quite so-called mental illness. So stigma is dangerous, stigma is traumatizing. It's really, shame is something which is given to people. It's the way we look at people that gives them shame. It triggers our shame response, which is a kind of, as I say, a variation of the trauma response. It's very difficult because they are stigmatized, they're treated very badly. Unfortunately, health services treat, there's various groups of people they treat badly, and as I say, I work with a lot of people who self-harm and they get treated really badly when they go to hospital, and I think people with drug and alcohol dependencies often get stigmatizing treatment. And there's also this emphasis with people who have drug and alcohol problems, they must give up the drug and alcohol. And that becomes everybody's kind of fetish, that they stop taking drugs and alcohol. And quite often, medical services want to give them other drugs, but not the drugs that they want to take, which just seems madness. It's often wonder whose madness is it and where does the madness lie, but that's a whole other discussion. I think and there's a lot of evidence for drug and alcohol dependency as being an attachment disorder, and if people can form healthy relationships and restore their ability to form good or create for the first time an ability to form secure relationships, they will stop taking drugs and alcohol. And they'll do that of their own accord. You can't stop people taking drugs and alcohol if they want to. And sadly, some people don't ever stop and they drink themselves to death. You can work with other organizations and try and deal with stigma if the other organizations are willing and able. And I went to something which, I can't remember who organized it, but it was fantastic with some drugs workers and prison officers. And it started off with the drugs workers and the prison officers just writing down all their stereotypes. So the stereotype of what a prison officer is like, big, vicious, violent, mean, right-wing, and also, etc. They just list. And then the drugs workers who are all left-wing hippies with wearing sandals, and so on. And they just wrote down their prejudiced views and their stereotypes, and then they swapped and they started talking to each other about their stereotypes of each other. You could do that with some drug and alcohol dependent people as well, if they could cope with it, if they were, emotionally able to. Or you could do it between staff and agencies. You can have discussions if the agency's willing. And it was unusual so I haven't seen that happen in all sorts of places. But it's a common problem, and that's the other thing that you can do, is that one of the reasons that they're treated with stigma is that the agencies that are supposed to work with them don't know how to. And therefore it's an endless source of frustration for the staff. These staff are tasked with making these people stop taking drugs and alcohol, but they can't do it. So they go to work and they get frustrated every day, and they start blaming their patients for their own frustration. And it's because they're doing an impossible task, and they're doing something stupid. And you can't say that, obviously you can't say you're doing something stupid. But what you can say is there are other ways of working which are more likely to be more effective if we work in this way, and you can look at psychologically informed environments. Greater number of people will go into treatment than if you don't practice in that way. They could look at making their services trauma-informed. They will get more people signing up to their outcomes if they do that sort of thing. So you can say, you can try and work with them on that. And beyond that, I think I'd just say good luck. Because this has been a battle for 40 years that I've been in this.
Moltes gràcies, Peter.